Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that doesn't begin with countdowns or collapsing wormholes. No one launches into the stars. No alien fleets descend. Instead, something far quieter happens, but it reaches everywhere. A single global decision. Harmless on the surface, practical even. Synchronize all time zones. Make noon mean noon, everywhere. One clock, one rhythm, one universal now. And at first, it sounds simple, elegant even. A way to erase confusion. A solution for jet lag and late-night meetings that span oceans. But tonight's story isn't about convenience. It's about what happens when time stops belonging to a place. Because time, real time, isn't just numbers. It's sky and shadow, light and silence. It's how people know where they are, when they are, and what they're supposed to feel while being there. So before we dive in, go ahead and take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you enjoy these slow, slightly surreal space detours. And if you're feeling generous, let me know in the comments what time it is for you right now, and what the sky looks like from your part of the planet. Now, dim the lights. Let your room settle. Maybe turn on that hum you always sleep to. A fan, a quiet air conditioner, or just the ambient echo of your corner of the world. Because what we're stepping into tonight is a thought experiment that might have already happened. A story where every hour strikes the same across the globe, and yet nothing feels quite right. Let's find out what happens when midnight comes for all of us, at once. It began with good intentions, like so many global experiments do. A summit, a vote, a press release, a coordinated effort to bring clarity to a fragmented world. One planet, one clock, the headline read. No more time zones, no more confusion. From now on, the Earth would run on a single universal time. Over 0 to 23.59, everywhere. At first, it was celebrated. News anchors smiled in coordinated segments as they explained that cities separated by oceans would now share breakfast hours, that flights and logistics would never again require time zone math, that what time is it there would finally become a historical question. The change was gradual. First came the digital systems, satellite networks, aviation routes, stock markets. Then national governments followed. Calendars, schedules, even school bells began to chime in perfect planetary rhythm. Midnight was now the same for everyone. Except it wasn't. In Tokyo, office workers stepped into midnight sunlight. In Cairo, the call to prayer now echoed beneath a dark noon. In Alaska, lunch breaks occurred in the still, silent cold of early morning. No one had moved, but time had. Not forward or backward, just sideways, detached, severed from the ancient rhythm that once bound every place to its own portion of the sky. Clocks still worked, but people began to hesitate. It started small. Reports of insomnia spiked across regions closest to the equator, where day and night had always been symmetrical. Farmers in Argentina reported that livestock refused to rise with their alarms. The cows know what's real, one man said in an interview. They don't eat at 2 a.m. just because the government says it's noon. In Mumbai, children began falling asleep in classrooms flooded with morning light. Teachers adjusted the blinds. Still, the fatigue spread. Bodies, it seemed, were slower than systems. Circadian rhythms, tuned over generations to local solar arcs, resisted the sudden realignment. It's not jet lag, doctors reported. It's drift, a kind of temporal vertigo. Meanwhile, the sky remained indifferent. Sunlight touched each region just as it always had. Shadows fell at the same angles. But now, those shadows no longer matched the time printed on the wall. In Paris, Cafes that once opened at dawn now lifted their shutters in darkness. In Sydney, concerts lit up arenas while the sun blazed outside. In Nairobi, people walked to work beneath a rising moon. The dissonance grew louder, not in decibels, in doubt. People began asking quiet questions. If midnight feels like afternoon, is it really midnight? If everyone agrees it's 6 a.m., but the birds haven't started singing, what are we really sinking to? In one survey, 73% of participants said they no longer trusted their own sense of time. The feeling was hard to describe. A vague, persistent wrongness, like a piano slightly out of tune, like watching a video where the audio lags behind the image. 1 second off, then 2, then 3. In rural Iceland, where daylight and darkness already played strange seasonal tricks, the new system shattered local perception completely. One resident wrote, "I stood outside in full sunlight at 3 a.m. and felt like I had fallen out of time, not ahead or behind, just beside it." Across social media, a new term emerged, clock shadow. It referred to the psychological residue left behind when official time diverged too far from sensory time. "It's when your body's in mourning, but the world says night," someone tweeted. "It's like wearing someone else's heartbeat." And the term stuck. Soon, articles appeared. How to cope with clock shadow. 10 tips for living against the sun. The secret damage of synchronized time. But the system held. Planes flew on time. Markets opened on time. Trains departed precisely at globally agreed intervals. The infrastructure had adapted, but biology had not. Sleep clinics overflowed. Light therapy sales surged. And in darkened kitchens around the world, people whispered to themselves as they poured cereal beneath stars. "This feels wrong. This isn't morning. Something's been dislocated." And still, the clocks kept moving forward, perfectly aligned, utterly indifferent. The first large-scale disruptions began in places where time had always followed light as closely as breath follows sleep. Coastal towns in the Mediterranean reported rising incidents of solar dissociation, a condition not formally recognized, but whispered about among exhausted clinic staff. Patients described sensations of being unanchored, adrift, or invisible to their own reflections. In Lisbon, a fisherman wrote in his journal, "I cast my net at 05, but the sea didn't recognize me." Across northern Canada, indigenous communities rejected the synced time altogether. Elders refused to reset their watches. One man told reporters, "You don't ask a river to run on schedule, you follow it." When asked how they coordinated daily life with cities now running on the new universal clock, he shrugged. "We don't. That's their time, not ours." By week 7, major cities had begun installing supplemental lighting in public areas to trick the eye into believing what the clock said. Tokyo experimented with massive artificial dawns. Vast LED panels casting amber light over entire blocks to simulate sunrise at 03 on Ouijarouz. In New York, street lamps stayed on well past what used to be daybreak. People wore light-correcting goggles. Cafes distributed circadian boosters. Caffeinated drinks tied to the new hour, regardless of sky color. But it was all scaffolding. Illusion layered over instinct. For every adaptation, something deeper unraveled. In Brazil, local governments attempted to reprogram school schedules to match new wakefulness cycles. But within days, students reported increased episodes of dissociation, chronic fatigue, and vivid hallucinations. Dreaming while awake. "It's not sleep deprivation," said one neurologist. "It's identity erosion. They're forgetting how to be in a moment." Meanwhile, in the Middle East, calls to prayer became dissonant. Imams followed the synced hours, but the faithful began missing the rhythm. "It feels like we're praying to something that isn't listening," said one worshipper. In monasteries, monks reported difficulty entering meditative states. "The bell rings," one wrote, "but time does not come." Art shifted. Filmmakers avoided clocks in scenes. Novels abandoned timestamps. Music became slower, ambient, directionless. A composer in Berlin released a symphony that could be played starting from any movement, at any speed. Its title, "Now is Always the Wrong Time." Psychological studies flourished. Therapists introduced terms like temporal anhedonia, the inability to feel time passing, and chronodissonance disorder, where patients experience physical resistance to hours they cognitively recognize. More than once someone would say, "I know it's midnight, I just don't feel it." But how do you treat a body that refuses to believe in the agreed upon reality? How do you convince blood and bone that 12 o'clock is universal now? Sleep studies turned into philosophical papers. One doctor remarked, "We're not just fighting biology, we're fighting every evolutionary survival mechanism that once taught humans when to fear, when to rest, and when to move." Religion splintered, not from heresy, but from rhythm. Faiths built around sunrises and lunar phases could no longer agree on when to fast, when to gather, when to mourn. A small sect declared the new time an abomination and went underground, literally, to live by subterranean light cycles. "If you can't see the sun," their leader said, "you can't be lied to." Yet the system persisted. Airlines celebrated historic efficiency. Corporations praised the elimination of scheduling errors. Governments called it the new temporal harmony. But underneath it all, a strange quiet began to grow. People spoke softer, laughed less. Eyes drifted. Focus thinned. Memories blurred. Not of events, of placement. No one was quite sure when they had last spoken to a friend. Not in time, in feeling. Across cities, clocks became less trusted. Not broken, just ignored. Watches were worn as fashion. Phones showed blank lock screens. A movement began called local noon, encouraging people to eat when the sun was highest, regardless of the official hour. It spread quickly, quietly, as if people were remembering something they hadn't realized they'd forgotten. A relationship, a rhythm, a reason, not logical, not modern, just ancestral. And somewhere in a tower in Geneva, the engineers who built the global time system gathered to review long-term data. Their instruments showed perfect coordination, zero latency, flawless accuracy. But none of them could remember the last time they had slept through the night. Months into the new system, people stopped asking what time it was, not out of adjustment, but fatigue. The global clock still ticked, still imposed its will through phone updates, digital signage, international broadcasts. But the question itself, once shorthand for orientation, for presence, now felt obsolete. Instead, people began asking different questions. How long has it felt like morning? When did your day begin? Are you ahead or just tired? These weren't metaphysical questions. They were survival tools. Because more and more, the hour on the screen no longer matched the feeling in the bones. Entire populations began developing local customs to anchor themselves. Not laws, not protests, just habits. In Seoul, thousands of commuters stopped commuting. They worked remotely not because it was efficient, but because stepping into the bright sun at 2 a.m. each day was beginning to feel like spiritual misalignment. In Buenos Aires, a quiet movement swept the city. People turned their clocks backward by 6 hours. not digitally, but emotionally. They still followed the global time outwardly, but among family and friends, real time was spoken with a glance. Coffee time, orange sky time, shadow hour. The hours were becoming poetic again, and poetry was more honest than the system. In Johannesburg, entire neighborhoods refused to adjust their lighting cycles. "Let the light tell us when," one resident said. The city council pushed back, but no one complied. Over time, enforcement softened, because the data showed something strange. People in those areas were sleeping better, reporting fewer illnesses, smiling more. The same pattern repeated elsewhere. In Thailand, temple schedules reverted. In small towns across Canada, Sunday services returned to sun clock times. Local mayors stopped enforcing synced hour curfews, even as federal schedules remained rigid. There was no rebellion, just erosion. The quiet wear of an imposed rhythm that had never been invited in. In an international broadcast from Geneva, the Time Cohesion Council tried to calm things down. They released animations, tutorials, optimistic messages. Global time doesn't erase your sky, it celebrates it. But celebration required resonance. And no matter how many coordinated countdowns they launched, no matter how many rocket launches and synchronized opera performances they aired, something had been lost. A whisper of difference. A reason for a place to be itself. Historians wrote that the invention of time zones in the 19th century was an act of unity, but the removal of time zones in the 22nd was turning out to be an act of subtraction. People began to forget what it felt like to belong to a region. Before, one woman said in a documentary, when I said it was 7 p.m., I meant something. I meant the color of the sky, the smell of dinner, the last warmth on the wall. Now I say 19 oi, and I don't know who I'm talking to. In rural Russia, people turned to silence instead. Villages let time pass without mention. No bells, no alarms. Children learned to wake by light. Meals happened when people were hungry. It didn't spread. It didn't need to. Elsewhere, cities adapted in more desperate ways. Dubai launched a project to tint its skyline according to synchronized global hour. Deep blue at night, amber at dawn. It worked, for a while. Until the people began complaining of headaches, vertigo, and a new phenomenon labeled color-time disjunction. "We're asking the eyes to lie," said one researcher, "and they're refusing." Schools suffered the most. Children, especially under 10, became increasingly dissociative. Teachers reported that while they were present physically, their concept of sequences, of cause and effect, before and after, had begun to blur. They finish their lunch before recess starts, one teacher said. Not because they're hungry, but because they don't trust the bell. Entire generations were growing up without knowing the difference between external and internal time. And when that difference vanishes, something else is lost too. Memory becomes abstract. Events no longer cling to landmarks. Stories lose structure. "I remember the wedding," a man in Istanbul said, "but I don't remember when the sun set. I don't remember if we danced before or after the light changed. I only remember the timestamp on the video." The timestamps replaced memory, but they couldn't replace feeling. And so a gap opened, a quiet one, the kind of gap that doesn't crack the surface, but hollows it. You don't see it, you feel it. A kind of global jet lag, but for culture. A yawning pause between the moment and the meaning. And yet, the system held. Everything on time. Everything precise. Everything slowly unraveling. The deeper the system embedded itself, the more it began to fracture at levels no one had predicted. Not in the infrastructure, That part worked flawlessly. Satellites kept orbiting. Transactions cleared in nanoseconds. Global meetings launched with synchronized precision. But beneath the technological harmony, something else was happening. Psychologists began calling it chronostress latency. Not anxiety, not insomnia. Something quieter, slower, adrift. People didn't feel rushed. They felt misplaced, as if they were performing their lives a few beats off from the original tempo. One researcher put it this way: you're living the right day in the wrong feeling. In Mexico City, musicians gathered in protest, but they didn't chant or shout. They played dissonant, asynchronous, their instruments tuned just slightly apart. Jazz quartets warped into swirling chaos. String ensembles collapsed into rhythmic uncertainty. They called it the Time Rupture Suite. Thousands came to listen, not because it made sense, but because it matched the way people felt, disjointed, free-floating, deep beneath Tokyo's surface, in abandoned subway corridors repurposed into shelters for those who had dropped out of the 24-hour synced economy. Murals began to appear. None showed clocks. Instead, they showed sky. Sky drawn with fingerprints. Sky twisted into spirals. One tunnel was covered in 24 panels, each painted in shades that didn't match the hour they represented. The sequence was broken, deliberately. On the wall, someone had written, "Time is not a line. It is a place, and we've moved out of it." Meanwhile, in California's desert, a group of former physicists launched a project called Echo Earth. They recreated local solar time using lenses, sundials, and analog instruments. No electronics, just shadow and reflection. Visitors reported the odd sensation of hearing time again. Not ticking, but settling. One woman said, "It was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was apologizing to the air around me." In digital spaces, things grew stranger. Users across social platforms began posting moments without time, photos without timestamps, videos without durations. Hashtags like "Nid when it felt right" and "Jiaxia's unclocked" trended for weeks. People began sharing memories not by date, but by feeling. The last time I saw rain on both sides of the street, that hour between laughing and knowing why, when the sky looked like it remembered something I didn't. Algorithms struggled to categorize this new wave. Content became untethered. Feed chronology dissolved. For the first time in decades, the internet felt timeless. And in that new silence, something else began to stir. A need, not for rebellion, not for revolution, just for return. In Switzerland, the headquarters of the Global Temporal Framework received a report compiled by independent researchers across 7 countries. It showed a slow, planet-wide decline in what they called subjective trust in moment. The report described it as a global erosion of temporal certainty, the sense that now is happening when it should, and it concluded with one line: the world is no longer sure when it is. The GTF dismissed the paper, politely, publicly, but internally, something shifted. Quiet meetings resumed. A task force was assembled, not to undo the system, but to study its psychological offsets. Still, outside that glass-walled world of data and schedules, the planet moved on. Or rather, it stood still. In a forest in Norway, a woman recorded herself each day at what the global clock called 8:06 Gaugu. She stood still, closed her eyes, and listened. For a month, nothing changed. On day 32, she flinched. The birdsong was gone. The recording went viral. Commenters wrote, "She didn't change. The hour did." Elsewhere, more recordings followed. Bees foraging at midnight. Cities asleep at noon. waves crashing out of sync with tides, not because the earth had changed, but because perception had severed from sequence. Humanity still rotated with the planet, but not with the sky, and that fracture, slow, cumulative, unmeasured, began to reshape how people spoke, moved, remembered, and in some cases believed. A preacher in Lagos stood before a crowd and said, "God gave us a sun to know the day. We replaced it with digits, and now we wonder why our dreams come without warnings." The congregation didn't shout. They didn't cry. They simply sat, still, as if waiting for the hour to catch up to the moment. It never did. By the third year of synchronized global time, people stopped counting anniversaries. They still celebrated birthdays, holidays, milestones. But the meaning attached to dates began to dissolve. Last year no longer felt like a place. It was a number, a loop, something rounded and flattened, like a calendar page permanently taped to a screen. People began to forget how long ago events had really occurred, not because of memory loss, but because the hours no longer connected emotionally. A wedding remembered at 17 Newly UTC felt less like a moment and more like a file. A funeral that took place during global daylight was recalled with confusion because the guests had stood in complete darkness. Time had become digital in the most literal sense, present everywhere, but meaningful nowhere. Governments didn't admit this publicly, but internal reports leaked. In France, one agency released a study suggesting that the synchronization policy had destabilized generational temporal identity, a term that meant grandparents and grandchildren now experience the concept of mourning as completely different psychological states. In Brazil, therapists began treating something they called hour dissonance grief, a form of emotional fatigue caused by repeatedly feeling things at the wrong time. But it was in urban China where the first technological remedy emerged. A private research group launched the chronomask, a wearable headband with internal sensors and embedded lights designed to simulate personalized circadian rhythm, regardless of external clocks. It tracked brain waves, eye movement, ambient light exposure, then adjusted internal time accordingly. The promise was seductive. You live in your own perfect hour. For a while, it worked. Test users reported improved sleep, better focus, and a strange sense of temporal centeredness. But the problem came later. Not physically, conceptually. Users began struggling to relate to others. "When I wake up," one user posted, "my partner's in the middle of her day. I tell her good morning. She stares at me like I've arrived from the past." Social interactions frayed. Teams couldn't align. Families became miniature timelines. Parents and children passed each other like planets on elliptical orbits, waving silently but never aligning. Some schools began issuing synchronized masks to students, hoping to control collective rhythm. But children rebelled. They switched settings. They shared configurations. One entire class in Toronto adjusted their masks to deep dusk and refused to interact before noon. The school eventually gave up and rescheduled classes. Still, demand grew. Chronomask sales tripled, then doubled again, then fractured into competitors. Soon, each person was living in a time of their own choosing. None of them real. The unified global hour persisted, of course. Trains arrived on schedule. Businesses logged transactions. The infrastructure was perfect. But the people were now temporal solitudes, sharing physical space but never the same moment. Language began to drift. New phrases emerged. Clock orphan, bright time lag, internal weather. One poet described herself as frozen at 9:14, and the phrase spread. On social media, people began posting their stuck hour, the time of day their body refused to move past. For some, it was late morning. For others, that strange stretch between dusk and nightfall. These weren't metaphors. They were coping mechanisms. In Australia, a performance artist held a public sleep-in at 13 Nauru UTC in a glass chamber beneath artificial moonlight. He called it reclaiming the night. For 8 hours he did nothing but dream in front of silent crowds. It was broadcast live. Millions tuned in. Many left their screens on long after it ended. It felt like resting, one viewer said, even though I wasn't asleep. Religious leaders responded in quiet, complex ways. Some temples reverted to solar rituals, regardless of clocks. Others went deeper, declaring that time itself was no longer sacred. We once said, "There is a time for everything," one monk noted. But now, everything happens at once, or not at all. Even language failed. Words like before and soon lost texture. Later became dangerous. It implied a sequence that no longer felt trustworthy. And so, people fell silent. Not out of despair, but self-preservation. Conversation became brief. Eyes lingered longer. Stillness replaced scheduling. People would gather for dinner, sit in silence and eat, not at a time, but at a feeling. A lull, a hunger, a dimming. Time, once measured in seconds, was now counted in shadows, and the shadows were growing long. Somewhere around the 5th year of global time synchronization, entire regions began adopting a new kind of silence. Not the silence of protest or loss, but one born from fatigue, from the quiet acknowledgement that speech, schedules, and planning no longer anchored people to reality. "I still speak," a man in Denmark told a researcher, "but the words don't know when they are." Sociologists coined a term for the phenomenon, temporal flatlining. It described the slow erosion of perceived time flow, a sense that days no longer pass through a person, but merely accumulated around them. Not decay, just sediment, dust of the hours. In India, university campuses began removing clocks from classrooms, citing student anxiety. At first, faculty protested, but then grades improved. Attendance rose. They stopped watching the hour, one professor wrote, and started watching each other. Across Scandinavia, public transportation began testing a system called sky time. Instead of fixed timetables, buses arrived based on natural light levels, humidity, and animal behavior. "We follow the crows," one transit official said. It was meant as a joke, but the routes ran smoother. Riders waited less. No one complained. In New Zealand, a government pilot program offered citizens an optional internal hour designation, essentially a digital badge declaring your chosen alignment: morning, daylight, dusk, or night. It was non-binding, symbolic, yet within weeks, entire neighborhoods self-sorted. Streets began to glow or dim according to collective identification, not by law, by comfort. "The world is reassembling," one anthropologist said, "but not by geography, by light." And while this soft fragmentation spread, a deeper shift was happening underground, literally. Subterranean communities, built decades prior for climate resilience, began experimenting with chronocaves, chambers designed to strip away all sense of linear time. No clocks, no cues, no light except for bioresponsive surfaces that adjusted based on heartbeat, breath rate, and neural activity. Participants emerged days or weeks later unable to say how long they had been inside. Some wept, others laughed, a few asked to go back. One woman described the experience as finally remembering what it feels like to be a creature, not a unit. Above ground, corporate interest tried to recapture control. Mega retailers launched ad campaigns based on eternal sales. No start or end date, just buy when it feels right. Streaming platforms eliminated episode orders. Series flowed like rivers. No season, no cliffhangers, only drift. And yet, none of this solved the core dislocation. People didn't want freedom from time. They wanted belonging to time. A version of it that felt earned, lived, understood, not assigned, not broadcast. In some places, desperation took hold. A sect in Eastern Europe began worshipping static clocks, devices permanently set to one chosen hour. Noon, sunset, 3:33 a.m. They believed that anchoring to a single sacred moment would restore continuity. The world fractured when we moved the hands, one elder said. We must let them rest. Another movement, called the Rewinders, advocated returning to staggered time zones. They began publishing local almanacs based on sun angles and shadow patterns, distributing them by hand to avoid digital trace. Membership was hard to track, but the symbols they used, spirals intersecting with straight lines, began to appear as graffiti across major cities. Meanwhile, the Coordinated Global Time Authority remained outwardly calm. Its statements were brief, optimistic, reassuring. Synchronization is a gift, said one spokesperson, a unity we've never known before. But leaked documents told a different story. Internal memos revealed the agency's concern over rising cases of temporal drift disorder, a new classification describing individuals whose internal sense of time ran completely unmoored from the shared hour. Some patients operated 6 to 10 hours out of phase with their environment. They functioned, they adapted, but they no longer belonged. In one recorded session, a patient said, "I'm always early, or late, or sideways." Another said, "Time doesn't land anymore, it just hovers." In a final attempt at emotional reconnection, the agency sponsored a worldwide campaign called The Hour of Us, a global pause where everyone, everywhere, would spend 5 minutes in reflection at exactly Waruya, UTC. Billions were encouraged to stop, look at the sky, and feel the presence of others doing the same. It was beautiful, quiet, poetic, and deeply unsettling, because in many places the sky looked completely wrong. Bright when it should have been dark, black when it should have been golden. In some parts of the world, people stared up at the stars and felt as though they were intruding on someone else's moment. One girl in Morocco whispered, "I think I borrowed this midnight from another life." And maybe she had. Or maybe, for just a second, the shared hour folded in on itself, not with clarity, but with weight, the weight of a clock that had tried to hold everyone, and ended up holding no one. As the 6th year of synchronized global time approached, the world began to shift not forward, but inward. The idea of keeping time became a kind of shared joke, a leftover phrase from a language that no longer applied. People didn't keep time. They wandered through it. Without reliable rhythms or regional reference points, navigation, both literal and emotional, began to dissolve. Travelers reported landing in cities and feeling temporarily dislocated within minutes. I arrived in Casablanca at what the airport said was 11:40, one woman said, but the air felt like late afternoon. My body thought it was dinner. My brain thought it was waiting for sunrise. I sat on a bench and cried for no reason. In response, an unlikely solution emerged. Moment maps. These weren't geographic or temporal. They were emotional, sensory, atmospheric. People began to chart places not by coordinates or hours, but by how the moment felt. A street in Amsterdam might be labeled quiet yellow. A plaza in Bogota marked edges of hunger. A rooftop in Seoul tagged moment before realization. The maps spread fast, hand-drawn, crowdsourced, digital overlays. A global project of reorienting not through logic, but sensation. Travelers learned to navigate not by when, but by how. Go 3 blocks past the scent of bread, one guide instructed. Then turn where the shadows thin, even if the sun's not up. Cities began printing localized maps without clocks. Only color palettes, symbolic arcs, gradients of emotion. Tourists reported fewer headaches. Locals smiled more often. Something was returning, not time exactly, but a kind of permission to feel again. Even airlines adapted. Some began offering ambient landings, adjusting cabin lighting and cabin announcements, not to the clock, but to local atmospheric conditions. Pilots no longer said, "We're landing at 06:45. Instead, we're descending into a sky of early silver." It was strange, poetic, comforting, but also unmooring, because not everyone adapted. For some, the lack of anchoring made memory unreliable. Patients with dementia or trauma-related disorders reported accelerated symptoms. "My grandmother no longer knows if she's remembering or experiencing something," one caregiver said. "She tells me about her wedding and then looks around the room like it might be happening right now." And in a way, she wasn't wrong, because when the hours no longer stack, when they blur, moments begin to overlap. Memories seep sideways. People in therapy described events from years prior with the urgency of present tense. "I'm still in the hospital. My son is still 10. The letter just arrived." It wasn't delusion. It was dislocation. And it was spreading. Artists captured it first. Installations appeared that looped back on themselves, rooms designed to feel like they were mid-breath. Paintings with no top or bottom. Stories with no beginning or end. A poet published a book titled "The Second That Stays," each page repeating the same line with different weather behind it. Scientists noticed it too, not in experiments, but in data loss. Observation logs from deep space telescopes began to show irregularities, not in what was seen, but in when. Pulsar readings drifted. Timestamps skipped. Some recordings looped, as if they had already been made before they were captured. "We're still detecting," one technician said, "but I don't know from where in the timeline." When asked to elaborate, he shrugged. "We synced our clocks, but did we sync the universe?" Meanwhile, underground communities flourished. Not hidden, just unclocked. Subways became places of refuge, not because they were safe, but because they felt outside of the hour. No sky, no expectation, only movement. One girl described the feeling of stepping into the train. "It's like pausing without stopping, like someone hit mute on the timeline." A new cultural concept emerged. Soft hour. It meant any span of experience that couldn't be measured, only entered. Lovers would say, "Let's spend a soft hour together." Friends would whisper, "I had a soft hour today. It held me." It wasn't about what happened. It was about how it didn't happen. No schedule, no edge, just presence. And maybe the world didn't need perfect precision anymore. Maybe it needed more soft hours. Maybe, after years of being told what time it was, people had decided to feel it instead. In the absence of time zones and the disintegration of shared temporal anchors, new rituals began to emerge. Not official, not even spoken aloud in many cases, but quiet customs people created to reassure themselves that they still belonged to something, somewhere. A woman in Prague lit the same candle every day at the moment the light through her window made the floorboards glow pale gold. She called it her anchor minute, though it often happened hours apart by the global clock. In Lagos, market vendors began opening not at opening time, but when the clouds turned a specific shade of pale green, that meant the heat would soon rise. People stopped asking for the hour and started asking for signs. Is it the time when the birds go silent? Is it the hour when the scent of bread disappears from the street? In Tokyo, a generation raised under universal time began speaking in dream metaphors. "I'm in my third hour of fog," one boy told his teacher when asked why he hadn't completed his assignment. "I can't hold pens in fog time." The teacher nodded and offered him paper with thicker lines. It was a strange concession, but it made sense. In a world without reliable sequence, tasks needed texture, not scheduling. Religious orders fractured further. Some sects abandoned all formal schedules, conducting services only when it felt like the world had slowed enough to listen. Others doubled down, creating artificial days, 20-hour, 40-hour, even non-repeating cycles. One order held morning prayer in total darkness and evening service under electric blue noon. "It's not about matching the sky," their leader said. "It's about marking meaning, carving shape into chaos." Across the Arctic Circle, small communities began building what they called sky wells, mirrored wells dug into the tundra that reflected only the sky, free from any human structure. They became places to measure change not by time, but by color. Locals visited daily, documenting the hue, naming them like moods. Copper hush, ash between thoughts, last silver before forgetting. It became a lexicon, a quiet code of orientation more powerful than numbers. And yet, not everyone embraced the drift. In corporate sectors, a movement known as chrono-consolidation emerged. It sought to reimpose discipline through microtime. Ultra-precise segmentation of activity into 5-minute units tracked by neural implants and behavioral scoring. "You can't fix the sky," their motto went, "but you can fix your part of the timeline." The system spread through competitive industries, finance, logistics, marketing. And for a while, productivity surged. Workers operated like machines, but side effects followed. People reported hallucinations of moments repeating, not déjà vu, full loops, as though they were trapped in a playback of their own routine. Some developed what psychologists labeled non-linear identity retention, the sense that one's past, present, and future selves had begun having overlapping conversations in thought. "I am already tired from tomorrow's meeting," one worker said before passing out. Across the world, language fragmented further. Entire cultures began dropping tense from their speech. Phrases like "I went" or "I will go" became simply "I go" or "I move" or "I dream." Children born into the system never learned time in the way their ancestors did. For them, now was a fluid state, emotional, shared, intuitive. School curriculums changed. Subjects like history were no longer taught as sequences, but as clusters of related feelings and outcomes. A teacher in Nairobi said, "We don't teach what came first. We teach what felt like silence and what broke it." Even memory studies evolved. Neurologists discovered that brain regions associated with sequence formation had begun to atrophy slightly in urban populations, not in a pathological way, but as an adaptive response to living in environments where chronological accuracy had no practical reward. Meanwhile, those who still lived by the sun, farmers, fishermen, nomadic herders, remained largely unaffected. Their rhythms held, not because they rejected the system, but because they were never truly inside it. A study from a university in Cairo found that communities who relied on local natural cues for time had better emotional stability, longer attention spans, and a higher sense of collective purpose. The irony was clear. The most technologically advanced society in history had engineered itself into temporal detachment, while the so-called unmodern preserved sanity through simple observation. But reintegration proved difficult. People wanted to return to something real, but didn't know how. You can't reverse a clock that no longer ticks. And so they kept creating moments, sharing them, preserving them like seeds in a collapsing archive. Some started recording voice notes, not with dates, but with tones. This one was spoken under heavy blue. This one felt like waiting for rain. Audio files filled with breath, laughter, birdsong, fragments of music. Not because they meant anything specific, but because they held presence. And that, in the end, was all people wanted. Not precision, not power, just a shared sense that they still lived in a world where moments mattered, even if they could no longer say when. By the 7th year, the effects of total temporal synchronization were no longer subtle. They were structural. Architecture changed. Buildings were no longer designed with windows as guides for daylight, but as screens to simulate whatever sky the global hour demanded. In Dubai, the largest residential tower rotated its facades to reflect whichever hour the coordinated world clock dictated, even if outside the sun was just beginning to rise. Residents lived inside light that lied. They called it convenience. They called it beauty. But the children inside those towers began drawing skies without stars. Not dark skies, just blank ones. A silent detail that no one noticed until a teacher in Seoul connected hundreds of student sketches and realized they no longer believed the sky changes. Meanwhile, biotech companies began releasing circadian stabilizers, micro-implants designed to regulate hormone cycles according to UTC rather than sunlight. The sales pitch was irresistible. Never feel jet lag again. But early adopters reported strange side effects. Emotional flattening, disrupted dreams, a sensation described repeatedly as being out of tune with my own breath. One man said, "I wake up on schedule, but it feels like someone else's morning." In hospitals, more cases emerged of temporal phantom perception. Patients experiencing hours that no one else could perceive. A woman in Finland claimed she heard bells at 03 Waashuao every night, even in rooms with no sound systems. A boy in Chile described a moment that never ended, a 30-second stretch of walking across a hallway that repeated 4 times in his perception. Researchers dismissed it as psychological, but it spread. And then, in London, a museum unveiled the first exhibition to explore time as invasion. It featured rooms filled with ticking metronomes, each set to a slightly different tempo. Visitors were instructed to walk through and describe their emotional responses. Many couldn't finish the tour. Some cried. Others stood still for long stretches, unable to move. One visitor simply whispered, "I think I forgot how to leave." The curator explained that the goal was not disorientation. It was remembrance. We wanted people to feel what it was like before synchronization, when time had flavor. But time was no longer something people tasted. It had become something that observed them. Smart homes adjusted lighting and temperature to match official hours, not personal need. Fridges opened with haptic feedback when it was time to eat, regardless of hunger. Digital assistants began reminding people not just of appointments, but of when they should feel tired, when they should want intimacy, when they should cry. "Your cortisol suggests sadness," one interface chirped. "Would you like to initiate reflection mode?" And many did, because the alternatives were worse. Floating untethered in a world without cues. In universities, students submitted assignments with no timestamps. Professors stopped marking late work. One said, "You can't punish someone for arriving at the wrong moment when there are no right ones left." The notion of deadline became metaphor. Projects were completed when they felt whole. This didn't mean chaos. Some work became better, deeper. But the shared frame of reference, the ability to say we did this on Tuesday, was gone. And in its place came something else. Not exactly timelessness, but surveillance. Because synchronization didn't just standardize the hour, it recorded it. Everywhere, at all times. Every camera, every server, every data point was now stamped with the same mark. Perfect alignment. A global signature of presence. But what began as coordination soon revealed itself as something more oppressive. In a leaked internal report from the ChronoNet division, engineers confessed they could now trace any movement, message, or digital action, not just by location, but by exact temporal placement. There is no such thing as before or after, one line read. There is only during. Privacy advocates protested, but few listened. Because the benefits remained undeniable, crime rates dropped, emergency response times improved, international collaboration soared, all at the cost of subjective existence. And slowly, society adapted. Not outwardly, the streets still moved, the lights still changed, but inwardly. People became watchers of their own rhythms, not participants, not travelers, just monitors. A woman in Athens wore 3 watches. None of them worked. "They're reminders," she said, "that I used to know what time felt like." Children played games with no turns. Conversations drifted into silence because no one knew whose moment it was to speak. Even dreams changed. Neurologists recorded new patterns. Non-sequential memory playback, layered timelines, and dreamscapes where the sky flickered between midnight and noon without transition. "We're not dreaming in time anymore," one researcher noted. "We're dreaming around it." And perhaps most telling of all, people stopped asking, "When are you free?" Instead they asked, "When do you feel open?" Because freedom had nothing to do with hours now. It had everything to do with presence, and the dwindling space left to inhabit it. The 8th year arrived without anyone noticing. Not because the date was hidden. It was printed, uploaded, flashed across every synchronized display in every city. But because the moment had lost its friction. No resistance, no recognition. Just another tick, indistinguishable from the last. And in this flattened timeline, people began to speak of the hour as if it were a separate intelligence. "The hour wants us quiet," someone whispered in a Berlin cafe. "It feels like we're not supposed to move right now." Conversations like that weren't rare anymore. They were common, because no one could deny the sense that the official global time, the coordinated moment, had taken on a kind of intention. It decided when people felt awake, when buildings shifted light, when streets pulsed with artificial rhythms, and while it had no consciousness, it had consequences. In Buenos Aires, traffic flow was altered so perfectly by predictive models that the city became eerily calm. Too calm. People started reporting déjà vu on their commutes. Not occasionally, but daily. "I think I already walked this corner," one man said. "Even though it's the first time today. Unless it's not today, I don't know." That uncertainty wasn't psychological. It was structural. Cities began folding inward, not physically, but temporally. Patterns repeated because algorithms optimized them that way. Cafes played the same playlist at the same minute across time zones. Grocery stores restocked in perfect loops. Children's TV programs aired in artificial sunrise sequences, regardless of whether it was dark or light outside. The world became a stage lit by mechanical sunrises, timed laughter, and choreographed tiredness. And in that performance, something deep and human began to disappear. In Ireland, a family discovered that none of their photos captured shadows anymore. The light was always perfect, balanced, but dead. "It's like the world forgot how to lean," the mother said. Her son, 8 years old, asked her what dusk looked like. She couldn't explain, because dusk wasn't a clock reading. It was a sensation, a tone of breath in the sky, a lull, a moment between meanings, and synchronized time didn't allow in-betweens. It demanded alignment, precision, harmony, at the cost of ambiguity, at the cost of awe. In medical centers, new conditions emerged. One was called sequence drift fatigue, defined as the emotional exhaustion from existing in a world where nothing felt sequenced properly. Patients described waking up already feeling late for events that hadn't happened yet. Others said they were haunted by memories they hadn't made. A woman in Singapore said, "I keep remembering things I never lived, but they feel real, like I'm borrowing someone's past." Neurologists found nothing wrong, but artists understood. They began creating temporal collages, sequences of photographs, sounds, and smells meant to evoke not a story, but a feeling of displaced memory. Exhibitions drew long lines, not for catharsis, but for recognition. "I think I dreamed this hallway. This smells like my grandmother's kitchen, except I never knew her. I don't know what this song is, but I know I've missed it." These weren't mistakes of memory. They were the symptoms of a deeper shift, a civilization whose anchor to linearity had snapped. And in response, a new underground movement formed. They called themselves the Intervals, not a cult, not a rebellion, just people who tried to rebuild presence without clocks. They lived by shadows, tides, and pulses. In one forest, they created a village where daily activity was determined not by plans, but by collective intuition. Meals happened when hunger synchronized. Songs began when enough silence had gathered. One visitor described the experience as remembering how to exist without a timestamp. The intervals didn't reject technology. They used it, but only to record, never to predict, never to impose. The moment should not arrive by appointment, their writing said. It should arrive like wind, unseen but felt. Their manifesto, translated into 43 languages, was simply called Soft Time. It wasn't a political text. It was poetic, fragmented, full of contradictions. But it struck a chord. And in strange corners of the world, subways, rooftops, sea vessels, people began printing it, whispering it, living it. Meanwhile, those in power doubled down. Governments rebranded UTC as the Common Pulse. Education programs taught children to ignore body signals and instead trust the beat of the hour. "It knows better than your feelings," one animation said, "because it is everyone's feeling at once." But it wasn't. It never had been. And under that enforced unity, loneliness bloomed like mold in the hidden corners of society. Not the loneliness of isolation, but of misalignment, of waking beside someone and realizing they're living in a different rhythm, of laughing at the wrong moment, of loving out of sync. And in that fracture, people began to disappear from themselves. Not dramatically, quietly. They stopped showing up to things. They missed their own lives. Because when time becomes a broadcast rather than a belonging, it ceases to be lived. It becomes observed, The hour keeps moving. The world spins perfectly. But something fundamental has stalled. Something that once said, "This is now, and it is yours." At the start of the 9th year, synchronized time entered a new phase. Not more precise, just more persuasive. It began shaping memory, not deliberately, not as an act of malice or control, but as a natural consequence of order repeating itself. When every hour is shared and every sequence optimized, the past starts to echo. People began reporting memories they weren't sure were real. "I remember celebrating my birthday last year," one man said. "But when I checked my calendar, I didn't. I was working, but I feel like I did." In cities like Oslo and Seoul, clinical psychologists started using the phrase false stability loops. Episodes where the brain fills in emotional blanks based on what should have happened, according to the schedule, not what did. A woman in Mumbai said she could recall a perfect dinner with friends, down to the lighting and table setting, only to find none of them had seen her that week. "I think I invented it because I needed it," she said. The phrase went viral. Needed memories. People began using it as a tag on social feeds, attaching invented recollections to photographs, dreams, quiet fictions. But the line between fiction and truth had already begun to dissolve, not in a way that caused panic, no riots, no moral outcry, just a slow exhale of certainty. Because when everyone experiences the same hour, the same curated rhythm of days, variation becomes suspicious. Deviations feel like errors. And so, people stop trusting what didn't fit. They stopped trusting what felt different. Meanwhile, a new technology entered the market. It was called MemBlock, a wearable that let users bookmark moments in real time and store them as verified personal timestamps. The promise was simple: proof of presence. Users could tap the device during a conversation, a walk, a kiss, and later retrieve the exact contextual data of that moment. Biometrics, audio, light levels, GPS, even emotional state. "Never forget what happened," the tagline read. But it didn't take long for unintended consequences to appear. Couples began comparing bookmarks. "You weren't as happy as you said." "I marked the moment and you didn't." Fights started not over events, but over their quality. One therapist noted that clients were becoming obsessed with rewatching their lives through MemBlock logs. "It's not about the memory," she said. "It's about the score, the rating, the confirmation that the moment was valid." But memories aren't meant to be valid. They're meant to breathe, to stretch and shimmer, to make room for feeling. And MemBlock's biggest flaw was its inability to capture silence. The quiet between gestures, the tremble before words, the pause where meaning hides. And so, in its precision, it began to erase the essence of experience. In parallel, governments rolled out a system known as Time Trust, a blockchain-based temporal verification protocol that ensured all official actions, decisions, and communications were recorded and assigned to a precise second. It was meant to increase transparency. "No more secrets," the spokespeople said. But the result was different. People began writing less, speaking less, acting less, because spontaneity couldn't survive scrutiny. One official said, "I stopped sending messages at night, not because I had something to hide, but because I didn't want the night to be logged." Artists responded by creating non-moments, pieces of performance art that only occurred outside surveillance range, in locations where satellite and signal couldn't reach. These weren't recorded, they weren't announced. They happened, and then they were gone. One was described as a choir humming inside a cave at midnight. Another, a silent procession through fog with no beginning or end. Audiences emerged shaken. "I was there," one woman whispered, "but I can't prove it, and that makes it mine." That phrase, "that makes it mine," became a kind of resistance, a whisper against the flood of confirmed reality, and under it all something deeper stirred, because Memblock data began showing patterns, not in individual users, but across thousands. At specific hours in different countries, people reported identical emotional spikes: anxiety, joy, nostalgia. These were not explained by weather, politics, or world events. They were spontaneous, simultaneous, like echoes from a tuning fork no one could see. Theories emerged. One said that the synchronized world had created an unconscious emotional resonance where feelings rebounded off shared schedules and returned amplified. Another suggested the system itself, the global hour, had created a rhythm so dominant that it began shaping the nervous system directly. "We're not just living in time," a neurologist said. "We're living under it." In one of the most watched speeches of the year, a teacher stood before a crowd and held up a paper clock with no hands. "We used to ask each other, 'What time is it?' she said. Now we ask, 'Does this time belong to me?' And no one answered. Not because they disagreed, but because they no longer knew. As the 9th year progressed, something strange began happening with archived footage. Not the kind hosted by governments or corporations, but personal videos, family recordings, vlogs, diary entries stored on cloud servers. When reviewed, they no longer matched the viewer's memories. A girl in Sao Paulo watched her birthday video from age 7 and swore the room had been different, the music quieter, the cake a different color. "I remember purple," she said. "This one is blue. I know it was purple." At first, it was dismissed as nostalgia distortion, the brain's tendency to color the past. But then patterns emerged. Entire families reported altered recall. "We all remember singing outside," said one man reviewing a reunion video. "But here we're in the kitchen. None of us recall that kitchen." Researchers launched a quiet investigation, and what they found disturbed them. Many recordings had not been tampered with. Metadata was intact. Bit-level verification passed. And yet, the content no longer resonated with lived memory. The term parallel recollection drift was coined, a phenomenon in which individuals shared the same false memory, even when contradicting verified footage. It wasn't mass delusion. It was emotional truth diverging from mechanical record, and it was spreading. A possible explanation was offered by the Memory Alignment Group, a consortium of neuroscientists and cognitive theorists. Their hypothesis was that continuous global synchronization had created contextual compression, a narrowing of temporal diversity so extreme that individual memory, unable to ground itself in varied time cues, began reshaping to fit the dominant rhythm. The same hour, their report read, produces the same expectation and eventually the same narrative. The implications were enormous. If lived experience was adapting itself to collective rhythm, then history, personal, social, even cultural, would eventually converge, not through agreement, but through erosion, through gradual realignment of memory to match the shape of time imposed upon it. And in a chilling twist, preliminary AI models trained on Memblock data began showing predictive recall capacity, generating likely memories a person would form at given hours, with shocking accuracy. One test subject wept when shown a fabricated memory created by the model. "I thought I made that up," she said, "but this video looks real. It even has my laugh." The AI had synthesized a false past so well, she began believing it. Across the world, Philosophers and historians debated what this meant. Was memory still sacred if it could be overwritten by rhythm? Was identity meaningful in a world where time wasn't just tracked, but sculpted? Meanwhile, in Paris, a rogue archivist group called The Unclocked began salvaging analog materials, paper journals, undeveloped film, handwritten letters, not for nostalgia, for resistance. The world is turning into one long yesterday, their founder said. We're not saving the past. We're saving the right to remember it differently. They established libraries beneath train stations, inside churches, even aboard retired ships. Places where you could walk into a memory not backed by metadata. And people did, in silence, without cameras, without timestamps, just breath, paper, ink. And yet, even that wasn't immune. Some claimed the smell of the paper was too clean, the ink too dark. I don't trust these pages, one visitor whispered. They feel printed for me. Elsewhere, museums adapted. Exhibits began organizing artifacts not by century, but by emotional tone. Despair cluster, discovery loop, hope in pale hours. Visitors wandered not through time, but through feeling. They left uncertain of what happened when, but more certain of how it felt. And perhaps that was enough. But governments didn't agree. Worried by the growing fragmentation of reality, they launched a new initiative, Unity Recall Protocol. The idea was simple: create one verified collective memory stream for every major event, certified and embedded in official archives to be used in education, public media, and citizenship tests. Critics called it synthetic history. Supporters called it stability. But the world changed regardless. In homes, people began marking their own time with rituals to combat drift. A woman in Toronto lit a match every night and whispered the name of someone she missed. Not at a set time, just when the house felt too quiet. A boy in Nairobi painted stones with symbols only he understood, burying them in different corners of the garden each morning. They helped me find the day, he said. These rituals weren't logical. They were anchoring. In a world where time had become a broadcast, rituals became a whisper, a resistance, a reminder that memory is not made of data. It's made of weight, of pause, of imperfection. And perhaps, one day, when the hour stops synchronizing, when the global hum finally falters, it won't be the archives that tell us who we were. It will be the uneven fragments, the stories that didn't line up, the dreams that never matched the videos, the lies we told ourselves to survive time that wasn't ours. In the 10th year of global synchronization, sleep began to change. Not just its patterns, but its essence. The human body, still biologically wired to local light and circadian rhythms, struggled under the weight of the coordinated moment. That perfect artificial now, repeated endlessly around the globe. People no longer fell asleep naturally. They scheduled unconsciousness. Devices called REM guides became commonplace. Wearable modules that injected bioharmonic pulses to simulate the initiation of rest. Fall asleep on UTC, they promised. Wake up in perfect alignment. But perfect alignment meant forgetting what tiredness felt like. Without local cues, the sensation of dusk, that slow dissolving gravity that pulled thought downward, disappeared. Sleep became procedural, precise, but empty. And as REM guide usage increased, a new syndrome emerged, memoryless rest. Patients reported waking up refreshed, but with no sense of having dreamed. No hypnagogic drift, no sensation of passage. It's like my night never happened, one woman said. I close my eyes, and a second later, it's 06 UTC. Dream researchers called it chrono-blank sleep. They warned that dreams, even nightmares, were essential to mental integration. But their warnings were ignored. Productivity metrics improved. Global collaboration skyrocketed. Sleep was no longer rest. It was uptime maintenance. And then, the drift began. In small pockets, in silence. People who stopped using REM guides began reporting strange phenomena. Elongated dreams, recursive landscapes, an overwhelming presence of clocks. Every dream has a timepiece, said a teacher in Buenos Aires. Sometimes digital, sometimes a sundial, but always broken, always wrong. One man claimed to have been trapped in a dream for what felt like weeks. "I lived a whole life," he whispered. "I had a child. I remember her name. I remember her voice." He wept when told no time had passed. Dream specialists were baffled. EEG patterns showed normal sleep cycles, but the content of dreams had changed. They were longer, heavier. Some even bled into waking life. A woman in Glasgow reported seeing her dream house appear faintly overlaid on her real apartment for several seconds each morning. "It fades slowly," she said, "like memory in reverse." In response, researchers developed a new term, temporal overdream. It referred to dreams that carried the weight of missing hours, compensating for the loss of lived experience during synchronized sleep. The brain, denied proper nightfall, began creating its own. But these dreams weren't just long. They were shared. In a secure experiment across multiple time zones, participants isolated from each other reported identical dream elements: a tower without doors, a staircase of mirrors, a voice counting backward in another language. Statistical probability ruled out coincidence. "It's like the dreams are syncing themselves," said one lead scientist, "as if the unconscious is resisting the imposed clock by building its own rhythm across people." The media dubbed it the Dream Underground. Forums emerged, whisper groups, audio logs. People compared their dreams, seeking patterns. They found them. Not just objects or places, but feeling clusters. A thick melancholy near hour 14, euphoric disorientation near hour 3, and a strange ambient pressure near hour 19, described as a silence too loud to hold. Sleep clinics were overwhelmed, not by people seeking treatment, but by people refusing to wake. They didn't want to escape. They wanted through. "I think my real life is on the other side now," one patient said. "I just visit here sometimes, for work." Governments panicked. If sleep became preferable to waking, productivity would collapse. And so they launched SomniTrack, a real-time monitoring network that mapped and corrected dream rhythms with gentle stimuli. A chirp, a pulse, a flicker of scent. But something went wrong. One night, over 200,000 people reported the same disruption. A soft knock at the door, in their dream, followed by the feeling that someone had entered and stood watching. It was reported across continents, across cultures. Same knock, same stillness, same visitor, and no one could explain it. Sleep had ceased to be private, and maybe it never was, because for the first time in human history, the most intimate, unmeasurable state, dreaming, had begun sinking, not through technology, but through need, a shared cry from the unconscious, a rebellion of the mind against the tyranny of artificial order. And beneath it all, in whispered voices, people began saying the same sentence upon waking: "I think I brought something back with me." By the 10th year's midpoint, a strange consensus had formed. Reality was no longer anchored to wakefulness. The drift between sleep and alertness had grown so thin that people began to treat dreams as valid memories, equal in weight to real experience. Psychologists stopped correcting clients who began sentences with "in my other life." Employers stopped asking for dream-free minds. They asked only that work get done, and increasingly it did. But not because people were focused, because they were haunted. The visitor from the shared dream, the one behind the soft knock, had returned, repeatedly, not nightly, not predictably, but often enough that it became a motif, a known presence. Artists began sketching it, a figure of indeterminate height, wearing no face, with hands folded gently behind its back as if waiting for something. It never moved, never spoke, but always looked. "You know it's there," one man said, "even when it's not in the frame." The dreams continued sinking. People across the globe began encountering the same architecture. Cities of doors with no hinges, oceans that whispered in binary, stairwells leading to replicas of rooms they remembered from childhood, but subtly wrong. Left-handed instead of right, windows on the wrong wall, family photos altered by a few pixels. The phenomenon was renamed Unified Subconscious Synchrony, or USS. Theories poured in. One camp believed the dreams were bleeding together through neural alignment, a side effect of standardized sleep schedules. Another suggested that humanity had reached a kind of psychic critical mass, a saturation point of data, routine, and repetition, at which point the unconscious mind began seeking escape by merging. But neither explained the figure, nor the growing emotional response to it. People weren't afraid. They were reverent, calmed. "It's not watching to judge," one woman said. "It's watching because we've forgotten how to watch ourselves." In some regions, spiritual movements formed, not cults, not religions, just gatherings of those who wanted to sleep together. In the same hour, under the same sky, in the same breath. They built sanctuaries with blackout windows, soundproof walls, and nothing but soft blankets, incense, and silence. These weren't orgiastic or chaotic. They were kind. Sleep became ceremony, waking an interruption. People left notes for each other on the walls. "I saw you by the lake. Your hands were light. We sang together without sound." And across cities, people who had never met began greeting each other with phrases like, "Good dream," or "Were you there last night?" And often they were. But not all dreams were gentle. Some were recursive traps, doors that opened into other doors, mirrors that reflected other people's memories. One boy entered a train in his dream and kept riding for what he described as a whole season of someone else's life. He woke up speaking a language he didn't know, a language that didn't exist. It took weeks to recover, if recovery was even the word, because increasingly people didn't want to leave. They didn't want to return to clocks, to the quiet throb of UTC. Wakefulness felt mechanical, flat, like standing under fluorescent lights in a room that pretended to be a home. Even the light outside felt wrong, calibrated, rendered. Sleep, by contrast, offered meaning, chaos, shape, not assigned by a system, but conjured by something older. And then, something irreversible happened. A satellite malfunction caused a 2-hour global sync lag. It wasn't much. A glitch in a relay node that delayed the coordinated world clock by precisely 121 minutes across the planet. But it was enough. For those 2 hours, the shared hum of the world dimmed. Buildings missed their temperature cues. Streetlights blinked at the wrong moment. People reported vertigo. Some wept, not from fear, from recognition. "I think I felt alone again," one woman said, "and I missed it." In those 121 minutes, sleep returned. Natural, deep, old, no guides, no prompts. People dreamed without symmetry, without matching. The visitor did not appear. When the clock was corrected, something had shifted, quietly, deeply. Like a floorboard warped under invisible weight. People woke, but differently, hesitantly, as if waking itself was no longer the default state. A scientist in Geneva published a paper titled Circadian Insurrection, The Return of the Self. It proposed that the unconscious was not resisting synchronization. It was repairing identity, reassembling what the coordinated moment had dissolved. Not just memories, not just sensations, but the ability to stand in time and say, I am here now, and no one else owns this second. The paper was deleted within 24 hours. Officially, it was inconclusive, but copies spread. People printed it, read it aloud, whispered its title before sleep. And then, as if summoned, the dreams began changing. The visitor stood further away. The clocks appeared shattered, and in one case, a dreamer reported seeing themselves sleeping. I was on the bed, and I wasn't breathing, but it wasn't frightening. It was a relief, like I had stepped outside the hour. The psychologist asked what they saw beyond the bed. The dreamer paused, then said, a sky without numbers, just wind. By the beginning of the 11th year, the world had stopped measuring time by movement. People still woke, still worked, still slept. But none of it felt like passage. Days no longer felt sequential. Mornings did not follow nights. There was light, there was dark. But they were placed, arranged like props in a play that had lost its script. Calendars were maintained out of politeness, not purpose. The date says it's Thursday, someone might say, but it feels like something else. No one questioned what that something else was. They just nodded. The coordinated moment, once a tool of unity, had become a backdrop. Static, present, but untrusted. And so people began making their own clocks, not mechanical ones, not digital, personal clocks. One woman kept track of time by watering a plant. When the fourth leaf droops, it's time to bathe, she said. A musician in Osaka composed an hour-long song for each feeling he recognized. I don't play by time, he said. I play by recognition. And in the Arctic Circle, where the light never played fair, a group of researchers built a glass tower filled with sand and heat sensors. They lived according to when the glass felt warmest. It's honest, one said. The sun doesn't lie, only the schedule does. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of orientation, attempts to feel grounded in something that wasn't dictated. And yet, beneath this slow drift, a quieter transformation was taking place. Memory, once fractured, was beginning to crystallize. But not around events, around moments, unmeasured, unrepeatable. One man kept a journal of seconds he never wanted to forget. A breeze through curtains, the sound of feet on gravel, the way a stranger's hand brushed his on a train. None of them had timestamps, he wrote, but they felt eternal. And maybe they were, because in a world that no longer trusted time to mark what mattered, eternity became a sensation, not a span. And then the sky changed, not visibly, not astronomically, but perceptually. Astronomers began receiving reports from amateur sky watchers, stars blinking out of sequence, constellations appearing in the wrong position, not because of drift, but because people saw them differently. Orion looked backward last night, one report read, as if someone mirrored him. The phenomenon was labeled LSP, localized stellar perception. Scientists chalked it up to atmospheric irregularities and data lag. But the reports kept coming. I saw the moon twice, another said. Not a reflection. 2 full moons, one above the other. No recordings captured it. No telescopes confirmed it. But enough people saw it, felt it, that the line between shared illusion and new reality thinned. One possibility emerged. Perception was becoming temporal, not in the traditional sense, but in a new one. A reality shaped not by the speed of light, but by the speed of remembering. Because when enough people believe a moment happened and enough others accept it, it does, at least for them. And when that collective framework is stronger than the universal clock, time begins to bend around belief. The coordinated moment couldn't compete. It remained precise, untouched, but irrelevant. The world was no longer ticking. It was resonating, with dreams, with feelings, with shared fragments. And slowly, a term returned from the early days of synchronization. It had been discarded, dismissed as metaphoric, but now it rang true again. Soft time. Time that flexes, that listens, that adapts, and perhaps most importantly, time that forgets what it was told to be. People began making maps, not of places, but of moments. A train station that always felt like autumn. A corner of a library where sadness lingered. A cafe that tasted like reunion. Time lives here, they would write in the margins, but not in order. These maps were exchanged in secret, folded into books, etched into stone, left in public restrooms and between the pages of abandoned novels. No one claimed authorship, because in a world where the hour had lost its voice, the only remaining truth was the shared whisper. I felt this too, and it was enough. By the end of the 11th year, something had gone missing. Not a person, not an object, a certainty. The feeling that time was still happening. People continued to function. Trains ran. Messages were sent. The lights in skyscrapers flicked on and off with algorithmic grace. But beneath the surface, something vital had slipped. It wasn't that people no longer tracked hours. It was that they no longer believed in them. The global systems kept ticking, projecting the illusion of flow, but no one could quite remember what had occurred yesterday, or whether yesterday was even still a useful word. In one city, clocks were banned entirely, not because of rebellion, but because they became offensive. It's cruel to suggest this is still moving, someone wrote in graffiti. And perhaps they were right, because the coordinated moment had collapsed into itself. It still operated, still processed, still broadcast its perfect numbers, but it no longer meant anything. It had become a shadow of time, not its container. And into that vacuum, new forms of meaning emerged. In Paris, people began tracking glimmers, short flashes of felt experience too small to be called events, too significant to ignore. A hand touching a window, laughter in an alley, a breeze that seemed to carry an answer to a question no one had asked. Glimmer logs replaced diaries, not what happened, but what shimmered. One artist described the process. I don't document the hour, I document the bend. In Buenos Aires, a school began teaching children to write non-linear reports. Assignments like describe 3 moments from today that didn't happen in order, but belonged together. Students excelled. They began communicating in clusters of feeling instead of paragraphs. A boy's report read, I remembered the soup from last week. Then I heard my mother say something she hasn't said yet. Then I saw the color blue outside the window. That was today. No teacher corrected him. How could they? Time had fractured. Reality had softened. An experience, real, living experience, had begun to reassemble itself in ways the old systems couldn't track. Meanwhile, scientists, unable to quantify what was happening, turned to metaphor. They spoke of temporal porosity, of time becoming like sponge or fog. One paper described the coordinated moment as a frame without a painting, perfectly built but empty. In a lab in Australia, an experiment was conducted where participants were asked to live without time entirely. No clocks, no schedules, no exposure to any artificial rhythm, only sun, hunger, movement, conversation. After 40 days, the participants emerged. They had no idea how long they had been inside, but they could recall every detail, not in order, but in depth. One woman said, "I don't know how long I lived in there, but I know how I lived." The difference was subtle, but profound, because the longer the world lived under a single synchronized clock, the more people realized something sacred had been lost, the ability to shape one's own rhythm. And with that realization came change. Quiet, slow, but undeniable. Families began inventing rituals again. Not religious, not ceremonial, just grounding. One family lit candles every time a child laughed. Another rang a bell when it rained. These actions meant nothing to outsiders, but inside they were time, not abstract, not standardized, just present. And in some places, people began returning to caves, forests, the deep sea, not to escape, but to re-enter reality. One man in Iceland lived for a month with no artificial light and came back saying, "The world still breathes. It just forgot how to be heard." And slowly, the maps changed again. This time not of space, or glimmer, or feeling, but of silence. Places where the hour stops, they were called. Locations where time's pressure vanished. A bench under a specific tree. A hallway in an unfinished building. A corner of an attic that held no shadows. These places became sacred, not because anything happened there, but because things didn't. And in those absences, people remembered what it meant to exist without narration, without proof, without chronology, just existence, raw and breathless. And maybe that was the final lesson. That time, when forced to align, forgets how to flow. That rhythm cannot be imposed. That the world does not need a single clock to move forward. It needs many small pulses, felt in the chest, in the wind, in the weight of a glance. The coordinated moments still echoed across screens, satellites, and speakers. But fewer people listened. Fewer people obeyed. And as that silence spread, something unexpected happened. People began feeling younger, not in body, but in possibility, because time, once shattered, no longer held them captive. It simply waited, quietly, to be found again. By the 12th year, the world had stopped pretending the coordinated moment still mattered. It continued to tick, a silent metronome buried beneath layers of habit, but it no longer governed movement, meaning, or memory. Instead, communities began building their own clocks, not machines, but social rhythms, collective pulses formed from shared presence. In the Finnish archipelago, one village marked time by the return of a certain bird that flew low across the lake, only when the air felt like late spring. In Cairo, a district known for its alleys full of jasmine began ringing small bells every time someone said the word remember. These weren't schedules. They were agreements. Quiet rituals passed by word, by glance, by breath. The world had not collapsed without global synchronization. It had simply changed shape. In place of chronology, people began building resonance systems, frameworks of shared feeling, repeated patterns of meaning that allowed groups to stay emotionally connected, even as objective time faded. One such system emerged in the Andes, where farmers gathered every 12 sunsets, regardless of weather, to tell stories from lives that might not have happened, and yet felt more real than the ones documented. These stories were not fantasies. They were truths unmeasured. A man spoke of his daughter who vanished into the wind and became a pattern in the clouds. A woman recalled a river that spoke her name, even though she had never seen it, and everyone listened, not for accuracy, for alignment, because truth had become less about fact and more about shared gravity, and perhaps that was enough. In high-altitude labs in Switzerland, physicists noted a subtle phenomenon. Clocks placed in emotionally resonant spaces, places where people gathered to grieve, laugh, or pray, began showing microscopic variations in timekeeping. It wasn't measurable in seconds. It was deeper. The rate of atomic decay itself seemed to shift slightly, as if physics had grown sensitive to emotion. At first, it was dismissed as interference, but the more they tested, the more it held. One researcher whispered, "Time may not be a constant, it may be a consensus." That line spread, not as a theory, as a philosophy. People began organizing their lives not around what came next, but what felt now. Entire cities restructured their lighting systems based on collective emotional surveys. If enough people felt sad, the city dimmed. If joy surged, warm hues returned. Traffic patterns changed based on pulse sensors, not schedules. And still, no one missed UTC, because no one needed it. Not anymore. Deep beneath the Pacific, in one of the last functioning underwater colonies, a new type of archive emerged. The breathing record. It wasn't a database. It was a room filled with sound. Layers of voices, murmurs, fragments of stories, strung together like tide and wind. Visitors didn't search it. They entered, sat, listened, and left changed. No record of entry, no proof of use. But those who came back often said the same thing. It remembered me. That line, "it remembered me," became a kind of echo, passed between strangers like a code. People tattooed it on their arms, etched it into walls, whispered it into pillows before sleep. Because in a world that no longer demanded proof of sequence, memory became sacred, not as evidence, but as presence. And then, in the deserts of northern Africa, a city with no clocks was built. Not metaphorically, literally. Every building was constructed with intentional asymmetry. Every room flooded with indirect light. There were no mirrors, no windows that opened the same way twice. The city pulsed, not with time, but with sensation. Days were marked by scent, hours by the angle of heat. People called it Nadira, from the old word for rare. No one ruled it, no one mapped it, but everyone agreed it was real, even those who had never been there. "I dreamed of Nadira," people would say. "I smelled cedar and citrus, and I knew where I was." And that perhaps was the future of time. Not direction, but recognition. Not progression, but return. Not what is next, but what is felt again. One philosopher wrote, "The clock was never broken. We just forgot what it was for. Not to count, to feel." And across the scattered world, people nodded. Not in agreement with a fact, but in resonance with a truth too quiet to speak. As the 12th year drew toward its end, something astonishing happened. No one noticed. There was no celebration, no countdown, no anniversary of the coordinated moment's arrival. It had been 12 years since the world aligned its clocks to a single rhythm. And now, that rhythm pulsed only as a faint hum in forgotten hardware, still maintained, but no longer believed. What replaced it wasn't chaos. It was texture. Across continents, new systems of orientation emerged, grounded not in seconds or schedules, but in context. People stopped asking, "What time is it?" Instead, they asked, "What is this moment for?" The answers varied. For listening, for breathing, for remembering who I used to be. These responses weren't poetic, they were practical. Time had transformed from metric to medium, no longer a ruler, but a canvas. And on that canvas, something unexpected appeared. Continuity. Not the kind forged by calendars, but a deeper coherence made of mutual noticing. In northern Canada, a village coordinated its days by the migration of local foxes. When the foxes slept near the frozen river, it was time to share stories. When they vanished into the hills, it was time to work. No one checked watches. They simply watched. In Hong Kong, a district shifted its commerce according to a subtle consensus of mood. When people felt rushed, shops closed early. When they felt curious, bookstores stayed open through the night. Algorithms couldn't explain the trend, but it worked. And far from failing, the economy adapted. More importantly, so did the people. They were calmer, slower, more precise with what mattered. And it wasn't only humans adjusting. Machines too began responding differently. AI systems trained on human engagement metrics faltered when schedules disappeared. Their predictions misfired. Their routines collapsed. But when retrained on emotional resonance patterns, using ambient sound, pulse fluctuation, and linguistic tone, they flourished. One language model began anticipating user needs not by query time, but by emotional weather. It knew when to offer silence, when to recall a favorite quote, when to say nothing. Engineers called it intuitive response latency. Poets called it kindness. And in orbit, satellites designed to maintain precision timekeeping found their signals drifting, not from failure, but from disuse. Earth no longer looked up for the tick, it looked in. And still, memory remained central. In Nairobi, a museum opened called the Hourless Archive. It featured no dates, no epochs, no timelines. Instead, visitors moved through rooms named after sensations. The edge of becoming, the place you forgot, warmth without origin. Artifacts floated in air currents, suspended in fields of static charge. You reached for them not by name but by proximity, by the way they made your skin remember something without words. In one exhibit, a small clay bowl with no description drew over 30,000 silent visitors in its first season. No one knew who made it, but everyone left with tears. And perhaps that was the future. Not to know, but to feel. Not to organize time, but to be organized by it, from the inside out. One researcher summarized it this way. Our mistake was thinking time moved us forward. It never did. It just held space for us to arrive over and over again. That idea spread. Children grew up with no concept of lateness, only readiness. Hospitals began measuring patient recovery not in hours or dosages, but in laughter, posture, and gaze. Cities redesigned their transport to accommodate hesitation, adding waiting gardens where buses once required strict schedules. And in the quiet, former engineers of the coordinated moment gathered. They were not ashamed. They were not bitter. They spoke softly of the original intent, to unify, to connect, to help the world speak in harmony. We weren't wrong, one said. Just early. The clock we built was too loud. The one they built now, it listens. And everywhere, people build more clocks. Some made of paper and breath, others made of footsteps and grief. One girl used tears. Every time I cry, I mark the wall. When the wall fills, I start over. She was asked what she was measuring. She smiled. Return. Because that's what time had become. Not the line we travel, but the place we come back to. Again and again. The same warmth, the same ache, the same pause before a name. Not because we forget, but because that too is remembering. By the 13th year, the coordinated moment, that singular global rhythm once thought essential, had vanished from daily life. It still existed, humming invisibly through satellite infrastructure and legacy systems. But no one spoke of it. No one set their watches by it, and no one aligned their lives around it. It was a ghost frequency, a mathematical artifact of a world that once believed time could be commanded. What replaced it was something older, deeper, quieter. A new kind of presence, not measured in minutes, but in awareness. People had grown used to moving without schedule, waking not when alarms dictated, but when their dreams concluded. Working not until the clock said stop, but until their thoughts grew still. And in this world, something unexpected began to emerge. Harmony, not the rigid symmetry once pursued by synchronizers, but the living, pulsing coherence of a species breathing together across endless distances. Cities began to drift into states, not hours, moments shared by sensation instead of schedule. A fog that made everyone slow down. A rainfall that made conversations softer. A sudden burst of wind that turned every head in the same direction. These weren't events. They were alignments, not of action, but of attention. In the rebuilt districts of Beirut, residents gathered nightly around silent fountains that ran only when the air tasted a certain way. Salty, warm, with a hint of steel. No one knew what triggered it, but when the water flowed, people stopped speaking, stopped scrolling, just listened. And somehow, it was always the right time to do so. In New Zealand, an open-air library allowed visitors to return books not by deadline, but by intuition. A single bench near a tree glowed faintly when a book was ready to come home. No fines were issued, no records were kept, and yet return rates soared. Trust replaced tracking. And as trust grew, something stranger still began to occur. The reappearance of unrecorded time. Moments that weren't supposed to exist began surfacing in memory. People remembered conversations they never had, but which changed them. Journeys they had never taken, but which shaped who they became. These weren't false memories. They were felt memories, deeply embedded in muscle and bone, as if history had expanded sideways instead of forward. One neurologist in Munich wrote, "It's as if we're finally accessing the forgotten folds of the present." And those folds grew thicker, more inhabited. Some described encountering familiar strangers, people they couldn't name, but whom they remembered laughing with. Others found objects in their homes they couldn't recall acquiring, but which fit so perfectly they didn't question them. Time, it seemed, was no longer a line. It was a field in bloom, and people moved through it not as travelers, but as gardeners, tending to rhythms, to feelings, to returns. They stopped asking what year it was. They asked, "What kind of season is this for your spirit?" And the answers made sense. A warm dusk, a cracked window, the taste of old music. These weren't metaphors, they were timestamps, true to a world that had stopped needing numbers. And in the final remnants of the old order, in the deep servers of the last remaining chronocore, the coordinated moments continued to tick, quietly, without broadcast, without audience. But someone, somewhere still listened. In a small control room buried beneath what used to be Geneva, a solitary technician checked the system weekly. She didn't maintain it out of duty. She maintained it out of reverence. Time used to mean control, she said, brushing dust off a console. But now it just means memory. She didn't try to update the protocol. She simply recorded what the moment had become. Not a directive, but an echo. A reminder of the attempt, the ambition, the hope that time could bring us together. And perhaps, in failing to hold us in unison, it succeeded in something better. It gave us space to become who we were, separately, together. Somewhere between the 14th and 15th year, though no one counted anymore, the world stopped waiting for time to begin again. It had become clear that there would be no return to the old cadence, no resurrection of the global tick-tock that once stitched lives together in rigid sequence. And with that acceptance came peace. Not apathy, not stagnation, but an unspoken, gentle agreement that each person, each place, each breath would unfold according to its own rhythm, and that this was not disorder, but music. Across the world, people began building places of stillness, not monuments, not temples, but locations where the illusion of time's push fell away completely. In rural Japan, a bridge was built that led nowhere. Visitors walked to its center and stood in silence, watching the fog drift through the beams, listening to birds that did not seem to migrate anymore. On the western coast of Ireland, an open circle of standing stones was arranged so that no shadow ever landed the same way twice. Children were taught to walk its edge when they felt lost, not for answers, but for grounding. "Time will not find you here," the guide would whisper. "Only presence will." And all across what used to be called Earth's time zones, people began to speak a new kind of language. Not verbal, not linear, a language of shared noticing. Two people passing each other might exchange a glance and both understand. This is a moment of softness. Or, we are not meant to speak right now, only breathe the same dusk. Time had ceased to separate. It had become the quiet thread pulling all perception gently inward. In Antarctica, where once the lack of daylight broke minds, a new research station thrived, not by resisting timelessness, but by embracing it. There were no lights on timers, no assigned wake cycles, just a large central chamber where researchers gathered when they felt the pull, a strange, wordless urge to be together. They called it the Chamber of Once, not because it was for the past, but because it honored that every moment happens only once, and then lives forever in the curve it leaves behind. The few remaining temporal archivists, those who once tracked the global tick, had become something else entirely. Keepers of the gentle echoes. They no longer recorded what happened. They recorded what lingered. A phrase repeated across years. A gesture passed from stranger to stranger. The taste of fruit that no longer grew, yet still appeared in dreams. They wrote not in sequence, but in spirals. Journals with no beginning, just return. And those spirals grew. Cities once ruled by rush hour became places of drifting cadence. Markets opened when farmers arrived. Streets filled when the air felt curious. A man in Morocco painted clocks with melted gold, none of which had hands. He called them intentions. A woman in Alberta trained birds to chirp only when the air pressure signaled incoming dreams. She released them at dusk. No one asked what time it was. They simply waited for the sound. And all over the planet, people whispered a line that had no author, but had somehow entered the collective breath. Now is not a point. Now is a place you could return to, a place you could build a home inside, a place where others were always already waiting. And somewhere far above, in the forgotten corners of low Earth orbit, a small satellite that once pulsed the coordinated moment continued to loop in silence, its transmitter long disabled, its circuits cooled, and yet, inside, a single light blinked, not in urgency, not in signal, just blinking, like a heartbeat, out of rhythm with anything but itself. A final reminder that even the most structured systems, once freed from control, do not vanish. They transform. And maybe that's all time ever was. Not a force, not a master, but a mirror, waiting patiently for us to stop, look inward, and remember who we were, who we are, and who we've always been when no one is watching the clock.